Roughly 2 weeks ago, as of the time of this video's release, the newest RGG Summit was announced. In the midst of that, the vast majority of the franchise has gone on sale on Steam, with the exception of none other than Yakuza 3. Between this and Yokoyama-san stating how Kiwami 3 was an inevitability for the studio, which was mentioned back on April 1st, 2024, the community has started speculating about Kiwami 3's announcement yet again. Now, given that the summit is 2 weeks away, and that this project may indeed get announced, I decided to finally cover this topic in a relatively short and concise manner on the channel, to avoid backloading the summit summary on September 24th. So, to answer the most obvious question right out the gate, no, Yakuza 3 genuinely doesn't need a remake at present time. I've long been of the opinion that there are higher priority releases to tackle before releasing such a project. For example, some form of playability for Kenzan, Dead Souls, Kurohyou 1 and Kurohyou 2 in English and on modern consoles. Same rules apply for OG Yakuza 1 and 2, whose re-release would be the perfect way to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the franchise. So whether we're talking relatively simple ports, or remasters, or even remakes for the first 4 entries that were mentioned, these are the projects that should, in my opinion, be tackled first. I'm not opposed to the existence of a Kiwami 3 from a general standpoint down the line, but even as a massive fan of the original and the advancements the Dragon Engine allowed for, I'd say an entry like K3 would likely divide the fanbase, which could be backed up by the project's complex history in the online discourse. Assuming you're fairly new to the community, you might be wondering why the premise of a Kiwami 3 specifically would be such a heavily debated on subject at all. Well, it boils down to 2 things. One is the general reception towards OG Yakuza 3, and the other is the nature of Kiwami games in general. With regards to Yakuza 3 itself, it's commonly been seen as the entry that separated casual enjoyers of the franchise from players who'd end up going through the entire series and becoming hardcore fans in the process. This game stands out substantially from the other mainlines, due to the extensive focus on the orphanage in the story and the mechanical jump new players would go through by progressing from a Dragon Engine game to the remaster of an early PS3 era game. This is probably most evident in the combat department, with the infamous amount of Blokuza comments, which from my perspective were blowing the matter out of proportion. Nevertheless, the notion that Yakuza 3 would benefit from a Kiwami treatment was continuously brought up by a portion of the community. Now, interestingly enough, up until a few years ago, the people I'd most commonly see asking for this remake were ones that simply didn't like the original game, and wanted it to finally become, quote-unquote, actually playable. However, in stark contrast to this, we've recently also seen a rise in people wanting to just re-experience the original with modern sensibilities like updated visuals, an expanded version of Okinawa, and so on, which was a promising turn of events. This evidently doesn't apply to the entire community, hence why the question of whether or not Yakuza 3 should be remade is still heavily debated on, just with a wider variety of opinions by both sides of the argument. As for the other general point I've brought up earlier, that being the nature of Kiwami games in general, the fact they are the budget projects RGG worked on between major releases ended up saddling them with some unique preconceptions. Kiwami 1 and 2, for instance, were examples of RGG using a variety of assets from the mainlines directly preceding said remakes, with some minor improvements present from one development section to the next. Whereas Ishin Kiwami, and yes, this is another Kiwami game, essentially brought the biggest amount of assets from the entry it was remaking on board. The main difference was that its development marked the team's first time publishing a game in Unreal Engine, which meant some new and unexpected technical setbacks would also show themselves. Each of these games has a complex history in the community, with Kiwami 1 being the closest to being considered a generally beloved game by much of the community, or perhaps the one that divided far less of the fandom compared to the other 2 remakes. So, having covered these points, you can now see why the idea of tackling a relatively divisive game, in this case Yakuza 3, in a comparably divisive way, i.e. through a Kiwami treatment, could lead to a never-ending back and forth in the community. Now, with regards to the substance of Yakuza 3 itself, what would be the common issues some fans would want to see addressed through a remake? Going by popular discourse, these would be the pacing of the story and the combat in general, which is where things get interesting. Going off RGG's past efforts, the stories of the remakes are largely unaltered from their originals, with the only notable differences being the addition of Nishiki scenes in Kiwami 1, the Majima saga in K2, and the altering of select face actors in Ishin Kiwami. The Critical Path's general narrative would therefore be nigh identical to the original. So, just as my fellow content creators from the RGG cast have pointed out, the people taking issue with the pacing or overall nature of Yakuza 3's story wouldn't change their minds on the game through a remake, assuming K3 didn't become a complete overhaul on what a Kiwami game would be. Obviously, certain minor alterations would need to be made, considering the recent death retcons of 3 cast members, but I don't see much more than that happening, even though an expanded version of events would be great to see. Then there's the question of the combat. This might actually be a bigger issue to address than the story, because this raises a myriad of questions like, will the game feature more than one style to appease newer fans? Will it retain the advanced tech present that made the original so fun? Will it follow off from the creative choices of Gaiden and Pirate Yakuza, or will it take a step back to something like K2 and go in a completely different direction? Hell, putting all of that aside, in the event this ends up as an Unreal Engine style remake, what if this marks the return of the pre-Dragon Engine Dragon style for Kiryu? We can obviously make our speculations on this, but frankly, we have far less to go off in this regard than with the story treatments of the Kiwami games, just by nature of how different each of the modern Yakuza releases has been in terms of what they choose to alter. Plus, different parts of the community have different levels of engagement with the combat system, and they represent extremely different percentages of the online discourse compared to the size of the broader community. So, whatever your opinion on the combat changes could be, you're still gonna be met with vocal opposition in the opening months of the remake's release. I realize this has been a fairly pessimistic start to the topic, but consider this as the proverbial ripping off of the band-aid for an infamous topic of discussion. Now, we can actually go over some of the positives that could stem from a Kiwami 3. Starting off small, the upgrade system could be more in line with games like the Two Judgments, or even some of the earlier Dragon Engine games, where you have fewer boundaries between you and some of the most useful abilities of this entry, to make the early game's combat more fluid regardless of a player's skill level. The boss fights could finally get proper dynamic intros, as the final boss of this game was the very first instance of this feature's inclusion, at least in the form we now identify them. You could also update the boss movesets with things like mortal attacks and reversals, as could be seen with one of Gaiden's Colosseum challenges. The game could get more fast travel options, given how few taxis were available in OG3, and this new entry could finally add conventional sprinting to make up for the comparably larger size of both Kamurocho and Okinawa than it was in the older engine. Just make sure that the final upgrade to the sprint gauge, if there even is a sprint gauge, is actually an infinite, unlike in Ishin Kiwami. You could also merge some of the shorter sub-stories of the game into larger ones, or replace a few that are just of the beat up a guy, get paid, and you're done type of variety. Activities like these could be replaced with ones relevant to underdeveloped characters, like for example the kids at the orphanage, considering how important they'd be for Kiryu's personal growth and emotional payoff. Or you could use them for some of the minor antagonists that just appear and disappear, like Hasebe. Or you could just use them to offer more bonding time with the Ryuda family. There's a myriad of options present. Next up, some of the more prominent side activities in Yakuza 3, most notably the Hostess Maker, could be rendered less time-consuming and annoying to deal with in this remake. Worst case scenario, they replace this side activity with an updated version of the Cabaret from Lost Paradise, Zero, and K2, but include hostesses unique to Yakuza 3, rather than just continuing the past Cabaret storyline from the 1980s. Beyond that, depending on the budget of a K3, maybe we could finally get a Mine saga that predominantly focuses on some key boss fights and long battles for him, while doing away with the fillery bits that plague the Gaidens or the upgrade boundaries and lack of New Game Plus that plague the Kaito files. There's also all the stuff that's a no-brainer to feature in a modern RGG game compared to OG3, like being able to save the game anywhere, improved replayability due to fast dialogue skipping, or some visual upgrades that naturally come from the Dragon Engine, cause while I do adore the PlayStation 3 aesthetics of this franchise, and think they're frankly underrated in the community, even I think that DE Okinawa at Sunset would be the most mesmerizing thing that RGG has done. Lastly, the creation of a K3 could allow for subsequent beat-em-up entries to utilize some of the stuff from Yakuza 3 that has yet to return in a direct way, like the variety of heat actions that have been absent for a while now. The most important thing behind the prospect of this remake, no matter the side of the debate one might be on, is that we just don't remove the original in any capacity. Let these two games actually be complements to one another and stand out in their own right. These were my updated thoughts on AK3, speaking as a longtime fan of Yakuza 3 specifically. If you're curious why I haven't made this like a 30-minute video, especially with how opinionated I tend to be over this specific subject matter, well, that's because I already got to partake in an extensive conversation with some fellow content creators regarding the very topic of a Kiwami 3. So if you want to hear more about this specific subject, I can't recommend this video enough. That aside, let me know what you'd like to see from this remake, and if you believe we'll see a trailer for it on the upcoming summit. Either way, that is all for today. So, until next time, take care of yourselves, and have a great day. Cheers!